8. Next day, before the ladies were up, the vehicles, a cart and a small trap, stood at the porch waiting for the sportsmen. And Laska, having long ago made out that they were going shooting, after yelping and jumping about to her heart's content, was sitting in the cart beside the coachman, regarding the doorway whence the sportsman had not yet emerged, with excitement and with disapproval of the delay. The first to appear was Vasenka Veslovsky, in new boots reaching halfway up his fat thighs, his green blouse girdled with a new cartridge belt smelling of leather, and on his head the Scotch bonnet with the ribbons. He carried a new English gun without a sling. Laska jumped down to him and greeted him by leaping about. In her own way, she asked him how soon the others would come out, but, receiving no reply, she returned to her post of expectancy, and again sat motionless with her head turned sideways, and one ear pricked up. At length the door opened noisily, and out bounded, spinning round and round in the air, Krak, Oblonsky's yellow-spotted pointer, followed by Oblonsky himself with a gun in his hand and a cigar in his mouth. "Quiet, quiet, Krak," he said affectionately to the dog, which was throwing its paws up against his stomach and chest, and getting them entangled in his game bag. Oblonsky was wearing rawhide shoes, bands of linen wound round his feet instead of socks, a pair of tattered trousers, and a short coat. On his head were the ruins of some sort of hat, but his gun was of a new type, as neat as a toy, and his game bag and cartridge belt, though much worn, were of the best quality. Vasenka had been ignorant that the stylishness of a real sportsman consists in being dressed in rags, but having one's shooting implements of the very best quality. He realized it now that he saw Oblonsky in his rags, yet shining with his elegant, well-nurtured, cheerful, and gentlemanly figure, and resolved to follow his example next time. "Well, and where's our host?" he inquired. "He has a young wife," answered Oblonsky with a smile. "Yes, and such a charming one." "He was ready dressed. I expect he has run back to her." Oblonsky was right in this surmise. Levin had run back to ask his wife once more whether she had forgiven him his foolishness of the previous day, and also to entreat her, for heaven's sake, to take care of herself, and especially to keep further away from the children who at any moment might collide with her. Then he had to obtain a repeated assurance that she was not angry with him for going away for 2 days, and also to beg her to be sure next day to send a man on horseback with a note, only a word or two, that he might know that all was well with her. It was always painful for Kitty to part from her husband for 2 days, but seeing his animated figure, which seemed particularly large and powerful in high shooting boots and white blouse, and the radiant exhilaration of the sportsman in him, incomprehensible to her, she forgot her own pain in his gladness, and parted from him cheerfully. "Sorry, gentlemen," he said, running out onto the porch. "Is the lunch put in? Why is the roan on the right? Well, never mind. Laska, be quiet. Go and lie down." "Let them out with the flock," he said, turning to the herdsman who was waiting for orders about some young sheep. "Sorry, there's another rascal coming." Levin jumped down from the cart, where he had already seated himself, to meet the carpenter who was approaching with a sachet measure in his hand. "There, you see. You did not come to the office last night, and now you are detaining me. Well, what is it?" "Won't you have one more turning made? 3 more steps will be enough. Then we'll get it exact. It will be much more comfortable." "You should have obeyed me," said Levin with vexation. "I told you to set up the string boards first, and then to make the grooves. You can't alter it now. Do as I tell you, and make a new one." The facts of the matter were that in a new wing that was being built, the carpenter had spoiled the staircase, having made it without calculating the elevation, so that when it was put in position, all the steps sloped. Now he wanted to use that staircase, adding 3 steps to it. "It will be much better so." "But where will it reach to with 3 additional steps?" "Excuse me, sir," said the carpenter, smiling contemptuously. "It will reach to the exact spot. It will just stretch from the bottom, you see," he went on with a persuasive gesture, "and go up and up till it gets there." Why, but 3 steps will add to its length as well. Where will it get to? It will go up from the bottom, I mean, and reach to the top, the carpenter repeated obstinately and persuasively. It will reach up to the wall and halfway to the ceiling. Ah, no, excuse me. You see, it will start from the bottom and go up and just reach. Levin pulled out his ramrod and drew the staircase in the dust. There, you see? As you please, said the carpenter, his eyes suddenly brightening. Evidently, he had at last understood. It seems we'll have to make another. Well then, do as I told you, Levin shouted as he climbed into the cart. Drive on. Hold the dogs, Philip. Having left the cares of home and estate behind him, Levin experienced such a strong sense of the joy of life and anticipation that he felt disinclined to talk. Besides, he experienced that feeling of concentrated excitement which every sportsman knows when approaching the scene of action. If his mind was occupied with anything now, it was only with questions, whether they would find anything in the Kolpensky marsh, how Alaska would compare with Krak, and how he would shoot today. If only I don't disgrace myself before that stranger. If only Oblonsky's shooting does not beat mine, was his thought. Oblonsky shared these feelings, and was likewise not talkative. Vasenka Veslovsky alone chattered incessantly and merrily. Now, as he listened to him, Levin felt ashamed of his injustice toward him the day before. Vasenka was really a good sort, simple, kind-hearted, and very jolly. Had Levin come across him when still a bachelor, they would have become intimate. Levin did not quite like his holiday outlook on life and a sort of free and easy stylishness about him. He seemed to lay claim to a lofty and unquestionable importance because he had long nails, a Scotch bonnet, and everything else in keeping. But one could forgive him this for the sake of his good nature and breeding. He attracted Levin by his good education, his splendid accent in French and English, and by the fact that he belonged to Levin's own class. Vasenka greatly admired the Don steppe horse attached on the left. He went into raptures over it. How delightful it must be to gallop across the steppes on a steppe horse, eh? Don't you think so? He said. He seemed to picture a gallop on a steppe horse as something wild and poetical. Nothing came of it, but his naivete, in connection with his good looks, sweet smile and graceful movements, was very attractive. Whether it was that Veslovsky's nature was congenial to him, or that, to expiate his sin of yesterday, he tried to see only what was good in him, Levin liked Veslovsky's company. When they had gone about 3 versts, Veslovsky suddenly missed his cigars and pocketbook, and did not know whether he had lost them or left them on his table. He had 370 rubles in the pocketbook, and therefore the matter could not be ignored. Do you know, Levin, I will gallop home on this Don side horse. That will be grand, eh? He said, preparing to get out. No, why? Replied Levin, conjecturing that Veslovsky must weigh not less than 15 stone. I will send the coachman. So the coachman rode back on the side horse, and Levin drove the other 2 himself. 9. Well, where are we going? Tell us all about it, said Oblonsky. The plan is this. We are now going as far as Gvozdevo. On this side of Gvozdevo there is a good marsh for snipe, and beyond it are splendid snipe marshes, and there are some great snipe there too. It's too hot now, but we shall get there toward evening. It's 20 versts, and we'll shoot there in the evening. We'll spend the night there, and then tomorrow we shall go to the big marshes. And is there nothing by the way? There is, but it would delay us. And besides, it's hot. There are 2 nice little places, but we should hardly find anything there. Levin himself felt inclined to stop at those little places, but, as they were near home, they were always within his reach, and they were small, so that there was not room enough for 3 persons to shoot there. So he stretched a point and said they would hardly find anything there. When they came to a small marsh, he wished to drive past it, but Oblonsky, with the practised eye of a sportsman, noticed the marshy place from the road. Oughtn't we to go there? He asked, pointing to the marsh. Levin, do let us. How delightful, begged Vasenka Veslovsky, and Levin could not but agree. Scarcely had they stopped before the dogs flew toward the marsh, racing one another. "Krok! Laska!" The dogs returned. "There's not room for 3. I'll wait here," said Levin, hoping they would find nothing but the peewits, which the dogs had raised, and which, swaying as they flew, cried plaintively above the marsh. "No, come along, Levin, let's go together," said Veslovsky. "Really, there's not room. Back, Laska! Laska!" "You don't want 2 dogs?" Levin remained with the trap and looked enviously at the sportsmen. They went over the whole marsh, but there was nothing there except waterfowl and some peewits, one of which Veslovsky killed. "There, you see I was not grudging you the marsh," said Levin. "It only meant losing time." "No, it was enjoyable all the same. You saw?" said Vasenka Veslovsky, climbing awkwardly into the cart with his gun and the peewit. "How well I got this one, didn't I? Well, shall we soon get to the real place?" Suddenly the horses started. Levin knocked his head against the barrel of someone's gun, and there was a report. Actually, the report came first, but to Levin it seemed the other way about. What had happened was that Vasenka Veslovsky, when uncocking his gun, had pulled one trigger while uncocking the other side. The charge went into the ground without hurting anyone. Oblonsky shook his head and laughed reproachfully at Veslovsky. But Levin had no heart to admonish him. For one thing, because any reproach from him would appear to be provoked by the danger he had escaped and by the bump which had risen on his head. And also because Veslovsky was at first so naively grieved, and then laughed so good-naturedly and contagiously at their general perturbation, that Levin could not help joining in the laugh. When they reached the second marsh, which was of considerable size and would take a good deal of time, Levin tried to dissuade them from getting out. But again Veslovsky persuaded him, and again, the marsh being a narrow one, Levin, as a hospitable host, remained with the vehicles. Krok immediately went toward the hummocks. Vasenka Veslovsky was the first to follow the dog. Before Oblonsky had time to approach, a snipe rose. Veslovsky missed it, and it flew over to an unmown meadow. The bird was left to Veslovsky. Krok found it again and pointed. Veslovsky killed the bird and went back to the vehicles. "Now you go, and I will remain with the horses," he said. A sportsman's jealousy was beginning to torment Levin. He handed the reins to Veslovsky and went into the marsh. Laska, who had long been whining plaintively, as if complaining of the injustice, rushed straight forward to a likely spot, covered with hummocks, and known to Levin, where Krok had not yet been. "Why don't you stop her?" shouted Oblonsky. "She won't disturb them," answered Levin, pleased with his dog, and hurrying after her. Laska became more and more intent on her pursuit, the nearer she got to the hummocks. A small marsh bird only diverted her attention for an instant. She described a circle in front of the hummocks, and began another, but suddenly shuddered and stopped dead. "Come along, Stiva," Levin shouted, feeling his heart beat more rapidly. And suddenly, as if some bar had been withdrawn from his strained sense of hearing, he lost the faculty of measuring distance, and was struck by sounds which reached him clearly, but without any order. He heard Oblonsky's steps, and took them for the distant tramp of horses. He heard the crumbling of a bit of hummock on which he stepped, and which broke off, pulling off the grass by the roots, and he took it for the noise of his snipe on the wing. Behind him he heard too a sound of splashing, for which he could not account. Picking his way, he approached the dog. "Seize it!" It was not a great snipe, but a snipe that rose before the dog. Levin raised his gun, but just as he was taking aim, the splashing sounded louder and nearer, mingled with Veslovsky's voice shouting strangely and loudly. Levin knew he was aiming behind the snipe, but fired nevertheless. After making sure he had missed, he turned and saw that the trap and horses were no longer on the road, but in the marsh. Veslovsky, wishing to watch the shooting, had driven into the marsh, where the horses had stuck fast. "What the devil brings him here?" muttered Levin to himself, turning back to the vehicle. "Why did you leave the road?" he asked dryly, and calling the coachman, set to work to get the horses out. Levin was vexed that he had been put off his shot, and that his horses had been led into the bog, and especially that neither Oblonsky nor Veslovsky, neither of whom knew anything about harness, helped him and the coachman to unharness the horses and get them out of the bog. Without a word of reply to Vazenka, who was assuring him that it was quite dry there, Levin worked silently with the coachman to disengage the horses. But when heated with the work, and seeing Veslovsky pulling at the splashboard so strenuously and zealously that he actually wrenched it off, Levin reproached himself with being influenced by his sentiments of the previous day, and with treating Veslovsky too coldly. And he tried to efface his unfriendliness by particular courtesy. When everything was in order, and the vehicles had been brought back to the road, Levin gave orders for lunch to be served. Bon appétit, bonne conscience. Ce poulet va tomber jusqu'au fond de ma botte, remarked Vazenka, who had brightened up again, repeating a French saying while he finished the second chicken. Now our misfortunes are ended, and all will be well. But for my sin I must sit on the box. Don't you think so, eh? No, I am automadon. Wait and see how I will drive you, he said, keeping hold of the reins, in reply to Levin, who wanted him to let the coachman drive. No, I must expiate my sin, and besides, it's delightful in the box. And he was off. Levin was rather afraid Veslovsky would tire out the horses, especially the roan on the left, whom he did not know how to hold in. But he could not resist Veslovsky's high spirits, the songs he sang all the way while sitting on the box, the stories he told, and his representation of the English way of driving four in hand. And after lunch they were all in the best of spirits when they reached the Gvozdevo marsh. 10. Veslovsky drove so fast that they arrived at the marsh too soon, while it was still hot. When they got to the real marsh, the object of their journey, Levin involuntarily wished to rid himself of Vazenka and go about unhindered. Oblonsky evidently wanted the same thing, and on his face Levin noticed the preoccupation which every true sportsman feels before the shooting begins, and also a little good-natured cunning, characteristic of him. Well, what shall we do? It's a splendid marsh, and I see there are hawks too, said Oblonsky, pointing at two large birds circling above the sedges. Where there are hawks, there is sure to be game. Well then, gentlemen, said Levin with a somewhat gloomy expression, pulling up his boots and examining his percussion caps. You see that sedge? He pointed to a dark green little island in an enormous half-mown wet meadow stretching along the right bank of the river. The marsh begins here, just in front of us. You can see where it is greener? From there it goes to the right, where those horses are. There are hummocks and great snipe, and it goes round that sedge to the alder grove and down to the mill. Look, just there by that little bay. That's the best place. I once shot 17 grouse there. We will separate, going different ways with the two dogs, and we'll meet again by the mill. Well then, who goes to the left and who to the right? Asked Oblonsky. The space on the right is broader, so you two go there together, and I will keep to the left, he added with affected indifference. Good! We'll make the best bag, chimed in Vazenka. Levin could not avoid agreeing, and they separated. They had hardly entered the marsh when both dogs began searching together, and started off toward a rusty-looking spot in the marsh. Levin knew Laska's method of search, careful and dubious. He knew it, and expected to see a flight of snipe. Veslovsky, walk beside me, he whispered with bated breath to his comrade, who was splashing in the water behind him, and the direction of whose gun, after the accidental shot by the Kolpensky marsh, involuntarily interested Levin. No, I don't want to hamper you. Don't trouble about me. But Levin recollected Kitty's parting words. Mind, and don't shoot one another. Nearer and nearer came the dogs, keeping out of each other's way and each following its scent. The expectation of finding snipe was so strong that the smacking sound of his heel as he drew it out of the rusty mud sounded to Levin like the cry of a bird, and he grasped the butt end of his gun firmly. Bang! Bang! He heard just above his ear. Vazenka had fired into a flight of ducks, that were circling above the marsh, far out of range, and were at that moment flying straight toward the sportsman. Levin had barely time to turn before he heard the cry of a snipe, then another, and a third, and about 8 more rose one after the other. Oblonsky got one, just as it was preparing to begin its zigzag flight, and the bird fell like a small lump into the bog. Oblonsky quietly aimed at another, which was flying low towards the sedges, and at the moment of the report, that one too fell, and it could be seen jumping up among the cut sedges, fluttering with one wide-edged, uninjured wing. Levin was not so lucky. He fired at the first snipe too near, and missed. He followed it with his gun when it had already risen, but at that instant another rose just at his feet and diverted his attention, and he missed again. While they were reloading, another bird rose, and Veslovsky, who had finished reloading, fired 2 charges of small shot over the water. Oblonsky picked up his 2 snipe and looked with sparkling eyes at Levin. "Well, now that's part," he said, and limping with his left foot and holding his gun ready, he whistled to his dog and went off in one direction. Levin and Veslovsky went in the other. Levin, if his first shots were unsuccessful, always became excited and annoyed, and shot badly all the rest of the day. So it was this time. There were a great many snipe. They kept rising before the dogs and at the very feet of the sportsman, and Levin might have recovered himself, but the oftener he fired, the more he disgraced himself before Veslovsky, who was puffing away merrily, in and out of range, never killing anything, but not in the least abashed thereby. Levin hurried, grew impatient, and became more and more flurried, until at last he fired almost without hope of killing anything. Even Laska seemed to feel this. Her search became more and more indolent, and she looked round at the sportsman, as if in perplexity and with reproach. Shot followed shot. Powder smoke enveloped the sportsman, but in the large roomy net of the game bag were only 3 light little birds, and even of these one had been shot by Veslovsky, and another belonged to them both. Meanwhile, from the opposite side of the marsh came not frequent, but, as it seemed to Levin, significant reports from Oblonsky's gun, followed almost every time by a cry to the dog, "Kruk! Kruk! Fetch it!" That excited Levin still more. The snipe unceasingly circled above the sedges. The cry near the ground and sound in the air came incessantly from every side. The snipe that had arisen previously and had been flying about descended in front of the sportsman. Not 2, but dozens of hawks now soared above the marsh. Having traversed more than half the marsh, Levin and Veslovsky came to a spot where the peasants' meadowland was divided into long strips, the ends abutting on the sedge, and separated by narrow lines where the grass had been trodden down or cut. Half of those strips were already mown. Though there was little hope of finding as many birds in the unmown strips as on the mown part, Levin, having promised Oblonsky to meet him, went with his companion further on over the mown and unmown strips. "Hullo, you sportsmen!" shouted one of several peasants who were sitting beside a cart from which the horses had been taken out. "Come and have something with us. A drink of vodka." Levin turned round. "Come along, never mind," shouted a merry, bearded, red-faced peasant, showing a row of white teeth and holding aloft a greenish vodka bottle that glittered in the sunshine. "Qu'est-ce qu'il dit?" asked Veslovsky. "They're calling us to drink vodka. I expect they've been dividing the meadow. I should go and have a drink," said Levin, not quite disinterestedly, hoping that the vodka would tempt Veslovsky and lure him away. "Why are they offering it?" "Ah, they're only making merry. Really, you should go to them. It will interest you." "Allons, c'est curieux." "Go along, go, you'll find the way to the mill," cried Levin, and on looking round was pleased to see Veslovsky making his way out of the marsh toward the peasants, stooping and stumbling with his weary feet, and holding his gun at arm's length. "You come too," shouted a peasant to Levin. "Come, have a bite of pie." Levin badly wanted a drink of vodka and a bit of bread. He felt faint and could hardly drag his staggering legs out of the bog, and for an instant he was in doubt. But the dog pointed. His weariness vanished, and at once He went easily through the marsh toward the dog. Just at his feet rose a snipe. He fired and killed it. The dog continued pointing. "Fetch it!" Another bird rose before the dog. Lavin fired, but that day he had no luck. He missed, and when he went to look for the bird he had killed, he could not find it. He tramped all over the sedge, but Laska was incredulous of his having killed anything, and when he sent her to look for it, she only made a pretense and did not really search. Even without Vazenka, whom he had blamed for his ill luck, things went no better. Here too were plenty of birds, but Lavin missed one after another. The slanting rays of the sun were still hot. His clothes were wet through with perspiration and stuck to his body. His left boot, full of water, was heavy and made a smacking sound. Down his face, grimy with powder, ran drops of sweat. A bitter taste was in his mouth. The smell of powder and rust was in his nose, and the perpetual cry of the snipe was in his ears. He could not touch the barrels of his gun, they were so hot. His heart thumped with short, quick beats. His hands trembled with excitement, and his tired feet stumbled as he dragged them over the hummocks and through the bog. But he still went on and shot. At last, after a disgraceful miss, he threw his gun and hat on the ground. "No, I must pull myself together," he thought, picked up his gun and hat, called Laska to heel, and got out of the marsh. When he reached a dry place, he sat down on a hummock, took off his boot and emptied it, then went back to the marsh, drank a little of the rusty water, wetted the heated barrels, and bathed his face and hands. Feeling refreshed, he returned to the spot where a snipe had settled, firmly resolved not to get flurried. He tried to keep calm, but the same thing happened again. His finger pulled the trigger before he had taken aim. Things went from bad to worse. He had only 5 birds in his bag when he came out of the marsh by the alder grove, where he was to meet Oblonsky. Before he saw him, he saw his dog. Krak, quite black with smelly marsh slime, sprang out from beneath the upturned root of an alder, with the air of a conqueror, and sniffed at Laska. Behind Krak, in the shade of the alders, appeared Oblonsky's stately figure. He came toward Levin, red and perspiring, with his shirt unbuttoned, still limping as before. "Well, you've been firing a good deal," he said with a merry smile. "And you?" asked Levin, but there was no need to ask, for he already saw the full bag. "Ah, not bad." He had 14 birds. "A famous marsh. I expect Veslovsky was in your way. 1 dog for 2 people is inconvenient," said Oblonsky, to soften his triumph. 11. When Levin and Oblonsky reached the peasant's hut where Levin used to put up, Veslovsky was there before them. He sat in the middle of the room, holding with both hands to a bench, from which a soldier, a brother of the mistress of the house, was tugging him by his slime-covered boots, and he was laughing, with his infectiously merry laugh. "I've only just got here. Ils ont été charmants. Fancy, they fed me and gave me drink. What bread! Wonderful! Délicieux! And the vodka. I never tasted better. And they positively will not take any money, and kept on saying, 'No offence,' or something of that sort. Why should they take money? They were entertaining you, you see." "Do they keep vodka for sale?" said the soldier, who had at last succeeded in dragging off 1 wet boot, together with a blackened stocking. Despite the dirtiness of the hut, soiled by the sportsman's boots, the dirty dogs that were licking themselves there, and despite the smell of bog and of powder and the absence of knives and forks, the sportsman drank tea and ate supper with a relish known only when one is out shooting. Washed and clean, they betook themselves to a hay barn that had been swept out, and where the coachman had made up beds for the gentlemen. Though it was already dusk, none of the sportsmen wanted to sleep. After fluctuating between recollections and stories of the shooting, of dogs, and of other shooting parties, the talk reached a theme that interested all 3. Apropos of Vazenka's repeated expressions of delight at the charm of the arrangements for the night, of the scent of hay, and of a broken cart, which he thought was broken because its 4 wheels had been removed, of the good nature of the peasants who had treated him to vodka, and of the dogs which lay each at its master's feet. Oblonsky told them about the delights of a shooting party with Maltus, at which he had been last summer. Maltus was a well-known railway magnate. Oblonsky spoke of the marshes, which Maltus had leased in the province of Tver, of how they were preserved, of the vehicles, dog-carts, in which the sportsmen were driven thither, and of the marquee that was set up for lunch beside the marsh. "I don't understand you," said Levin, rising on his heap of hay. "How is it that those people don't disgust you? I understand that lunch with good claret is very nice, but is it possible that that very luxury does not disgust you? All those people, like the holders of our drink monopolies formerly, get their money in ways that earn contempt. They disregard that contempt. And afterwards, by means of what they have dishonestly earned, they buy off that contempt." "Perfectly true," chimed in Vasenky Veslovsky. "Perfectly true. Of course, Oblonsky does it out of bonhomie, and then others say, well, if Oblonsky goes there." "Not at all." Levin could hear that Oblonsky said this with a smile. "I simply don't consider him more dishonest than any of the rich merchants or noblemen. They have all alike made money by work and intelligence." "Yes, but what work? Is it work to get a concession and resell it?" "Of course it's work. Work in this sense, that if it were not for him and others like him, there would be no railways." "But it is not work such as that of a peasant or a savant." "Granted, but it is work in the sense that his activity yields results. Railways. But then you consider railways useless." "That's quite another question. I'm prepared to admit that they are useful. But every acquisition out of proportion to the toil contributed is dishonourable." "But who is to decide the proportion?" "What is dishonourable is the acquisition by wrong means, by cunning," said Levin, conscious that he could not clearly define the boundary between honesty and dishonesty. "Such as the profits made by banks. The acquisition of enormous wealth without work, just as in the days of the drink monopolists. Only the form has changed. Le roi est mort, vive le roi. Hardly were the monopolies stopped before railways and banks appeared, other means of acquiring wealth without work." "Well, all you say might be quite correct and ingenious." "Down, Crack!" exclaimed Oblonsky to the dog that was scratching itself and turning round in the hay. He was obviously convinced of the truth of his own view, and was therefore calm and deliberate. "But you have not defined the boundary between honest and dishonest work. I receive a bigger salary than my head clerk, though he knows the work better than I do. Is that dishonest?" "I don't know." "Well, then, I'll tell you. That you receive for your work on the estate a profit, let's say of 5,000 roubles, while our peasant host, work as you may, cannot get more than 50, is just as dishonest as my receiving more than my head clerk, or Maltus getting more than a railway mechanic. In fact, I notice a quite unjustifiable hostility on the part of the public toward these men, and it seems to me that it is envy." "Ah, no, that's not fair," said Veslovsky. "It can't be envy, and there is something not clean in their business." "No, allow me," Levin broke in. "You say it is unjust for me to receive 5,000, while the peasant gets only 50 roubles. That's true. It is an injustice, and I feel it, but—" "Yes, indeed. Why do we eat and drink, go shooting and do no work, while he is always working?" said Vasenka Veslovsky, evidently for the first time in his life thinking of this, and therefore speaking quite genuinely. "Yes, you feel it, but you won't give him your estate," said Oblonsky, purposely provoking Levin. A covert hostility had sprung up between the two brothers-in-law of late, as if being married to two sisters had evoked a sense of rivalry as to which of them would make the best of his life, and now this hostility found expression in the personal tone the discussion was assuming. "I don't give it away because nobody demands that of me, and if I wanted to, I could not do it," replied Levin. "Besides, there is no one to give it to." "Give it to this peasant. He won't refuse." "Yes, but how should I set about it? Should I go with him and execute a conveyance?" "I don't know, but if you are convinced that you have no right—" "I'm not at all convinced. On the contrary, I feel that I have no right to give it away, that I have duties toward the land and toward my family." "No, allow me. If you consider such inequality unjust, why don't you act accordingly? But I do act so, only in a negative sense, in the sense that I will not seek to increase the inequality that exists between my position and theirs. Pardon me, that is a paradox. Yes, that is a sophistical explanation, put in Veslovsky. Oh, our host, he said, addressing a peasant who had opened the creaking barn doors and was entering. So you're not asleep yet? No, how can I sleep? I thought you gentlemen were asleep, but then I heard you chatting. I want to get a crook here. She won't bite? He asked, cautiously stepping with bare feet. And where are you going to sleep? We're going to pasture the horses tonight. Ah, what a night, cried Veslovsky, gazing at the corner of the hut and the carts, visible in the faint afterglow through the now open barn doors, as in a frame. Just listen. It's women voices singing, and not at all badly. Who's that singing, mine host? Why, the maidservants close by. Come, let's go for a walk. We shan't sleep, you know. Oblonsky, come along. If only one could go without getting up, said Oblonsky, stretching himself. It's delightful to lie still. Well, then I'll go alone, said Veslovsky, rising quickly and putting on his boots. Goodbye, gentlemen. If it's jolly, I will call you. You've treated me to game, and I won't forget you. Isn't he a fine fellow? Said Oblonsky when Veslovsky had gone out, and the peasant had shut the doors after him. Yes, fine, answered Levin, continuing to think of the question they had been discussing. It seemed to him that he had expressed his thoughts and feelings as clearly as he could, yet both the others, sincere and not stupid men, had agreed that he was comforting himself with sophistry. This perturbed him. That's what it is, my friend. One or two things. Either you confess that the existing order of society is just, and then uphold your rights, or else own that you are enjoying unfair privileges, as I do, and take them with pleasure. No. If it were unjust, you could not use such advantages with pleasure. At any rate, I could not. The chief thing for me is not to feel guilty. I say, hadn't we really better go? Put in Oblonsky, evidently weary of the mental strain. We can't go to sleep, you know. Come on, let's go. Levin did not reply. The words he had used when he said he was acting justly in a negative sense occupied his mind. Is it possible that one can act justly only in a negative sense? He asked himself. Hasn't the fresh hay a strong scent? Remarked Oblonsky, sitting up. Nothing will make me sleep. Vazenka's up to something out there. Don't you hear the laughter in his voice? Shall we go too? Let's. No, I'm not going, answered Levin. Maybe you're stopping here on principle, said Oblonsky, smiling, as he searched in the dark for his cap. No, not on principle. But why should I go? Do you know, you will bring trouble on yourself, said Oblonsky, having found his cap and getting up. Why? Don't I see how you've placed yourself with your wife? I heard you discussing as a question of first-rate importance whether you should go away shooting for 2 days or not. That's all very well for an idyll, but it can't last a lifetime. A man should be independent. He has his own masculine interests. And man must be manly, said Oblonsky, opening the door. Is that to say he should court the maidservants? Asked Levin. Why not, if it's amusing? Ça ne tire pas à conséquence. My wife won't be the worse for it, and I shall have a spree. The important part is to guard the sanctity of the home. Nothing of that kind at home, but you needn't tie your hands. Perhaps, said Levin dryly, and turned on his side. Tomorrow one should start early, and I shall wake no one but shall start at daybreak. Monsieur, venez vite, came the voice of Veslovsky, who had come back. Charmante, it's my discovery. Charmante. A perfect Gretchen, and I've already made her acquaintance. Really very pretty, he said in such an approving way, as if she had been made pretty specially for him, and he was satisfied with the maker. Levin pretended to be asleep, but Oblonsky, having put on his slippers and lit a cigar, left the barn, and their voices soon died away. Levin could not fall asleep for a long time. He heard his horses chewing hay, then how the master and his eldest son got ready and rode away for the night to pasture their horses. Then how the soldier settled down to sleep on the other side of the barn with his nephew, their host's little son. He heard the boy, in his treble voice, imparting to his uncle his impressions of the dogs, which seemed to him terrible and enormous. Then how the boy asked what those dogs were going to catch, and he heard how the soldier replied in a hoarse and sleepy voice that the sportsman would go next day to the marshes and fire guns, adding, to stop the questioning, "Sleep, Vaska, sleep, or else look out." Soon the soldier himself began to snore, and all was still, except for the neighing of the horses and the cry of snipe. Can it be only done in a negative sense? Levin repeated to himself. Well, what then? It's not my fault. And he began to think of the coming day. Tomorrow I will start early in the morning and make up my mind not to get excited. There are quantities of snipe, and great snipe too. And when I come back, there will be a note from Kitty. Well, perhaps Stiva's right. I'm not manly with her. I've grown effeminate. Well, what's to be done? Again, the negative answer. Through his sleep he heard laughter and Veslovsky's and Oblonsky's merry talk. He opened his eyes for an instant. They were standing, chatting in the open doorway, brightly lit up by the moon which had now risen. Oblonsky was saying something about the freshness of a girl, comparing her to a fresh kernel just taken from its shell. And Veslovsky was laughing his merry, infectious laugh, and repeating something that had probably been told him by a peasant. You'd better strive for a wife of your own. Gentlemen, tomorrow at dawn, Levin mumbled drowsily, and fell asleep.